They locked me out at 9 o'clock IEMM sharp. By 9:03, I was already inside, somewhere they forgot to check. They thought it was done, that I'd disappear after the Zoom call, maybe send a passive-aggressive LinkedIn post and quietly move on, like a relic of the old guard, forgotten by Q2. What they didn't realize was that the moment Preston cut the call, I had already opened a second terminal window on my laptop, one that gave me access to a sandbox payroll environment they'd forgotten existed. 2 years ago, I was asked to quietly develop a contingency protocol for system continuity during emergencies, and being who I am, meticulous, prepared, invisible in the best way, I built it out as a mirrored backup clone of the full system, firewalled, self-updating, and linked to a shadow admin account tied to my credentials under a generic name buried under 10 layers of approval tokens. No one else even knew it existed because no one else ever asked how payroll actually works behind the front-end GUI. They were used to dashboards and graphs. I lived inside SQL queries and custom scripts. So when Preston smirked and said, "We're moving in a leaner direction," I didn't argue. I just let the silence stretch, nodded once, and logged out, at least from what they could see. What I didn't log out of was the core ledger, the real ledger, the one that still pinged my phone if any unscheduled batch override was attempted. And that's exactly what happened 3 days later, when his newly promoted digital finance director tried to authorize a mass shift in salaried disbursements using my scripts, but without the runtime triggers. I watched the log file flicker to life on my old ThinkPad while sipping coffee on my balcony, line after line of invalid token. Batch incomplete, override denied. Not yet, I whispered. This was never going to be an emotional retaliation. No public outbursts, no lawsuits, no rants, just precision, controlled exposure. For now, I let the system reject them quietly. It bought me time. Time to finish reconstructing the trail. Because before I left, I didn't just back up files. I also replicated access attempts, permission changes, server logs, and payroll batch history from the past 6 months. And buried in those logs was something far more useful than revenge. Patterns, unusual patterns. Bonuses pushed to consulting firms that didn't match approved vendor sheets. Payroll tax discrepancies flagged in March but mysteriously resolved without documentation. I didn't need to hack anything. I'd written the automation that watched for this exact type of anomaly. Now it was just a matter of mapping names to emails, emails to roles, and roles to responsibility. I set up 3 scheduled report packets, one to an outside payroll auditor I'd once mentored, one to a retired IRS investigator I'd done side contracting with, and one to myself. Encrypted, time-stamped, ready to auto-send if I didn't disable the timer every 72 hours. But before any of that, I had one meeting left, the kind they'd never see coming. I checked the calendar for the upcoming quarterly systems integrity sync Preston had carelessly left on recurring and smiled. Still scheduled, still virtual, still inviting my old admin account out of habit. They'd replace me without scrubbing the layers I'd built. So at 9 a.m. sharp that Thursday, while Preston assumed the meeting would be a backpatting session with his new team, I clicked join, camera off, microphone muted, and watched. Watched as they floundered through updates they barely understood. Watched as Janice, who once shadowed under me and now looked exhausted, struggled to explain why the dev environment wasn't compiling properly since the legacy scripts were too dependent on undocumented overrides. Watched as Preston looked increasingly agitated, repeating the word agile like it could rewrite a broken process. Finally, someone said, "Did Derek document any of this before he left?" The silence was glorious. That's when I activated the final piece, an anonymous screen share. I broadcasted a simple message: system documentation available upon audit clearance. Authorization ID required. Contact Derek C. No threats, no chaos, just presence. I left the call as quietly as I'd joined, knowing exactly what would happen next. The real meeting wasn't that call. It was the panic Preston would feel in 10 minutes. It was the string of emails already queued up for delivery by noon. It was the unmistakable message behind the silence. I was never really gone. And the system? It still knew my name. It started with a ripple. An internal Slack message from Janice to Preston that was accidentally forwarded to an old group thread I still had access to via a mirrored archive I'd set up years ago as part of our system redundancy testing. "He was on the call," she wrote. "You saw that, right? Someone joined under his credentials. We didn't remove his permissions like you said. That ripple told me everything I needed to know. They were nervous. They knew just enough to be dangerous, not enough to fix, but too proud to ask for help. And that was fine. I wasn't trying to help them. I was simply letting them walk into a room they'd sealed themselves inside. By the time they realized the windows didn't open and the door had no handle on the inside, I'd already lit the fuse. But here's the part they never considered: the real ledger. The actual financial heartbeat of our system was never the one they looked at. The dashboards, the quarterly summaries, the flash presentations for board meetings, those were built on sanitized layers. What I maintained was the bottom layer, the raw transaction streams, the log trails, the shell company pings, and the embedded metadata that no intern would ever think to clean. And because I knew one day I might be replaced by someone too eager and too shallow, I coded in fragments. Not passwords, not kill switches, just friction. Tiny dependencies. A query that wouldn't run unless a hidden config was updated. A timestamp offset tied to a specific time zone. A payroll batch routine that required the name Derek C. in the admin changelog to fully execute. They could delete me from org charts, but the system still whispered my name. That week, I watched from a distance as systems latency tickets piled up in their Jira queue. At first it was minor, processing delays in payroll exports, then misfires on tax deduction calculations, then errors with quarterly bonus allocations, numbers off by small but audit-singing margins. And then, silence. Not because the problem stopped, but because they didn't want to admit they had no idea how to fix it. So I made it easier. I let the system talk. I set the shadow ledger to start self-reporting. Every midnight, an auto-generator log summary was sent to 3 recipients: the audit team Preston had bypassed 6 months ago, the temporary CFO he'd convinced to retire early, and a whistleblower mailbox at the Department of Labor I'd anonymously registered years ago, back when I first noticed Preston fudging budget projections to inflate quarterly results. He probably thought I'd forgotten. I never forget, especially not patterns. Especially not when they involve falsified contractor hours billed through shell vendors tied to a consultancy group where Preston's brother-in-law sat on the board. That's the thing about people who fire others over Zoom. They assume you'll go quietly. They assume you won't understand what's worth keeping. But I kept everything, even the printer logs, even the flagged admin overrides that Zach from IT authorized without a second signature. He thought it didn't matter. But those overrides, small and seemingly harmless, were tied to cost reallocations that Preston signed off on. And those cost reallocations, they were miscategorized as R&D, allowing inflated depreciation write-offs. That's tax fraud. Not my opinion, that's IRS code. I didn't have to spin it or dramatize it, I just had to label it accurately. I packaged the findings into a 14-page PDF with one line on the cover. Submitted in confidence under USC 26, SS 7063, Tax Whistleblower Incentive Program. Then I dropped a copy, unsigned, encrypted, on Preston's desk via courier with a simple note: "You should have checked the shadow ledger." That evening, his assistant emailed me directly. "Mr. Preston is requesting a call." I didn't reply. Instead, I triggered Phase 2, the system patch. This wasn't malicious, it was procedural, a security update I'd drafted but never pushed live because Preston had deprioritized it in favor of launching a new UX dashboard. That dashboard was flashy, but it relied entirely on API calls built around my old config. Without the patch, every request would slow down by 12 to 17%. Not broken, just tired. Sluggish, frustrating, enough to get the board's attention. And they noticed. I got an email from Amelia Tran, board member, compliance chair, and the only executive who ever asked me thoughtful questions during reviews. Subject line: coffee? No threats, no spin, just coffee. I replied with a time and place. Neutral ground, the kind of cafe where the chairs wobble slightly and no one takes calls at the table. She arrived early, already seated. "You didn't do anything illegal, did you?" she asked directly. "No," I said, sipping calmly. "I just never deleted my access." They never asked. She nodded once. "Did you report it?" "Only what the system already knew." She didn't smile, but her eyes softened. "We'll be in touch." She left without saying another word. And just like that, the ripple became a current. They needed a name, so they made one up. Consultant was the term they used. External optimization strategist, supposedly assigned by HQ to help streamline internal processes during transition. His name appeared in 3 memos, 2 Zoom invites, and 1 project timeline update. But he never showed up on our VPN logs. No email address, no contractor packet, no W-9, no badge ID request, just invoices. Monthly. Neatly formatted, always the same structure, always just below the $10,000 0 cents threshold that would trigger audit flagging. That's the number that caught my eye, not because of its size, but because it was strategic. In my years overseeing systems and compliance, I'd seen this move before. Vendors kept just below the radar, recurring payments camouflage inside expense categories like operational risk mitigation or architecture analysis. And it wasn't just one consultant, there were 5. All paid from different departments, all billed from different LLCs, all using a domain that didn't exist 6 months ago. That's when I remembered the print job, a document that had been flagged by the internal routing server 2 weeks before my termination. It had keywords like restructure, offboarding plan, and IP risk zone. I hadn't looked too closely then, thought it was HR drafting policies. But now, with the shadow ledger whispering, I dug deeper. Recovered the print job metadata. Found the internal user who initiated it, Janice R., the same Janice who forwarded the Slack thread by mistake. I followed the trail. Janice wasn't part of HR. She was procurement, but she'd recently been given cross-departmental access for consultant onboarding. I scanned the document. It wasn't a policy. It was a roadmap, a calculated elimination plan targeting 5 senior employees across systems, engineering, and finance, all of whom had one thing in common. They'd built proprietary tools or held legacy admin rights. We were obstacles. Too expensive to retrain, too principled to go along. So the new CEO, Preston, needed a clean slate. Enter the ghost consultants. Each invoice detailed risk assessment reviews, compliance enhancements, and modular infrastructure audits, but not a single line item linked to tangible deliverables. No tickets, no diagrams, no version control uploads, nothing. It was a paper trail with no feet. That's when I knew this wasn't about redundancy, it was a corporate heist, a hostile remodeling, gut the original architecture, claim credit for the rebuild, write off the losses, repackage the company for acquisition or merger. Standard Silicon Valley playbook. But they forgot one thing. Every ghost leaves a footprint if you know where to look. And I did. Their mistake was underestimating the one person who still held keys to the original vault. Not the financial vault, the structural one, the code dependencies, the legacy mappings, the undocumented quirks that only lived in the minds of those who built them. I didn't build for applause, I built for resilience, for continuity. And in doing so, I embedded signatures, mathematical fingerprints that tied each system element to its original source. My initials weren't just inversion, comments. They were hashed into backup routines, into encryption salts, into error handling logic that rerouted during load stress, which meant when the consultants tried to clone the infrastructure, they triggered a silent divergence, a copy that would always lag, always bleed, quietly, invisibly. The system they were trying to inherit wouldn't fully breathe without its original lungs. I packaged the consultant invoices, ran forensic metadata checks. IP traces led to a shared workspace in Austin, except the suite didn't exist, just a P.O. box dropped at a Regus center. I mapped out the shell structure. 5 LLCs, all filed within the same 48-hour window under slightly different manager names, cross-referenced addresses. One listed Janice's fiancé as registered agent. Another listed an email that matched Preston's old portfolio site from his freelancing days. They weren't just laundering consulting fees. They were funneling company money back to themselves. Embezzlement hidden as optimization. And it would have worked if the 6th consultant hadn't been me. Not literally, of course, but one of the invoices used a project name I'd coined 6 years ago for an internal proof of concept that never launched. Neptune Graph Sync. No one outside the original dev team knew that term. It never made it to production. Never left our beta lab. I'd used it once in a buried devlog. And now it appeared on a $9,870 0 cents invoice for external graph efficiency testing. That was their fatal mistake. They stole a name that didn't exist, except in a place only I could have known. It proved they weren't just consulting. They were copying, plagiarizing, faking institutional memory. I printed the invoice, took a photo of my original devlog, labeled them past and forgery, and then I wrote one sentence. Funny how ghosts keep using my words. I attached both to an encrypted email to Amelia Tran, the compliance chair who had asked me for coffee. No context, no accusations, just the paper trail and the fingerprint. 30 minutes later, she replied, one word, understood. When Amelia replied with just one word, understood, I knew she had recognized the fingerprint, and if she'd recognized it, she was already thinking 3 steps ahead. But that didn't mean she could move publicly. Not yet. Not without risking retaliation, legal entanglements, or worse, being shut out before she could get close. I needed to give her something else, something internal, something their side couldn't see coming. That's when I remembered the server inbox. Every quarter, HR and IT compliance would run a sweep for orphaned inboxes, email accounts no longer in use but still active due to termination gaps or handover delays. As former systems manager, I had admin-level visibility to this list. It was routine work. So routine, in fact, that no one ever checked the inboxes themselves, just marked them for deactivation or archive. But one inbox stood out, compliance_initiatives@veltria.housing. It had been created 9 months earlier, supposedly for internal updates between Preston's transition team and compliance. No user had logged into it since my departure, but the auto-forward rule was still active. I rerouted the access path using my final day admin key buried under a temp redirect I had created for archiving purposes. The inbox cracked open like a sealed vault. What I found inside didn't just confirm the fraud, it painted the entire architecture of betrayal. There were email threads between Preston and his so-called consultant team, mapping out which departments to phase out, which tools to sunset, and how to use the payroll schedule as camouflage for staged restructuring. They had color-coded staff lists, green for keepers, yellow for maybe train, red for legacy risk. My name was red bolded underlined next to a note that read, "Do not let stay past Q2, retains too much systemic leverage." There it was, not performance, not salary, just leverage. They weren't afraid I'd fail, they were afraid I'd see too much. And they were right. Another email caught my eye. Subject, Neptune Sync Backup Removal Protocol. It was an instruction chain. The team had discovered one of the legacy backups I'd embedded, and they were trying to remove it before migration. But they didn't know it was a decoy, one I'd intentionally made obvious, because if they were chasing that one, they hadn't found the real redundancies. Those were still buried, off-site, time-stamped, hashed with blockchain signatures tied to my exit timestamp, untouchable. And then I saw the real gem, an attachment labeled Vendor Cap Tables Silent Stakeholders. I opened it. Listed in plain text were the ownership distributions of each Ghost Consultant LLC. Preston, 40%. Janice's fiancé, 25%. Graham, the so-called systems analyst who replaced me, 15%. The rest were spread across minor players in procurement and legal. It wasn't just theft, it was a network, a backdoor acquisition. And worse, they were planning to roll up all the fake vendors under one umbrella entity and pitch it for acquisition as a strategic partner. They were stealing from Veltria to build a company Veltria would eventually overpay to acquire. Internal cannibalization, boardroom laundering, and the person authorizing the fund transfers, approved by Jay Mercer, Director, Systems Finance. That's Janice's fiancé. They'd rigged every level. That night I exported everything into an encrypted container, 3 layers deep. Each folder required a different passcode. One based on my wife's birthday, one based on the first server I ever built, one based on a word from the internal naming convention only the board would understand. I didn't plan to send it. Not yet. I needed one more thread to pull. And I found it at 2:47 a.m., buried in an automated delivery confirmation. One of the Ghost Consultant invoices had listed an implementation toolkit as a physical shipment, tracked via FedEx to a downtown storage unit. That was odd. These were digital consultants. Why ship hardware? I followed the address. It was registered to a shell company called Hollingsworth Tech. Never mentioned before. I flagged it. Then I emailed Amelia again, this time with a header that read, "The storage locker you should visit before Monday." No context, no signature, Just a timestamp, an address, and a 3-word sentence. It's all there. Then I wiped my trail, logged off the system, and sat in the dark for a long time, listening to the low hum of the backup drive spinning quietly across the room. The email came at 5:13 a.m., timestamped just minutes after I sent Amelia the address. It wasn't meant for me, it was forwarded by accident, most likely through a misconfigured CC loop in the old Neptune chain that still had my ghost admin alias active. The subject line was vague. Follow up. Package confirmed. Instructions needed. The body, however, changed everything. Locker 42C verified. Contents match. Neptune diagnostic profiles. Awaiting directive. Do we proceed with reformat plus burn or preserve for secondary review? Risk of exposure growing. Beneath it, a PDF attachment, just 18 kilobytes. I opened it and stopped breathing. It wasn't documentation. It was a photo. Grainy, time-stamped, clearly taken from a warehouse camera. Inside the frame, a server rack, 3 laptops, and a set of binders I recognized immediately. They weren't just trying to erase traces of fraud. They were preparing to destroy the legacy backbone of our infrastructure. Everything Veltria had relied on for the past decade. My decade. And then I saw something worse. A red tag attached to one of the drives. Archival-cross keychain. That was a kill signal. H-cross was shorthand for hard crosslink, an internal code used for marking systems flagged for permanent removal from off-site sync. It was supposed to be used only in extreme risk scenarios, like legal exposure or third-party audit subpoenas. Someone had escalated. Someone panicked. I pulled the metadata. The photo had been taken 36 hours ago, meaning the storage unit wasn't just a stash point, it was a staging area, and the burn protocol could go into effect at any moment. I needed to move. But I couldn't do it alone. That's when I forwarded the image to one person, Jeremy, our former compliance engineer. He'd been quietly laid off 2 months before me, supposedly due to restructuring, but I knew better. He'd once told me that Preston had tried to push him into signing off on a rushed vendor audit, one Jeremy refused to validate. That refusal vanished from records days later, but I had screenshots. I texted him, "Jay, need eyes on something. You were right. Meet?" 10 minutes later, he replied, "Location?" I sent him a pin to the diner 2 blocks from the storage unit. Jeremy showed up in an old hoodie, eyes wary. "They're burying everything," I said, sliding the image across the table. "You remember the old Neptune fallback systems?" He nodded slowly. "Yeah. You think they're in that unit?" "Not just that, more. They're calling for a burn, probably today." Jeremy leaned back, processing. "Why now?" "Because someone triggered the chain. Possibly me." He nodded. "Then let's go." We didn't talk much on the drive, just silence and shared understanding. The kind only people who've both been discarded, without explanation, can share. At the unit, I didn't expect the manager to cooperate, but I still had my old badge, the kind IT forgot to deactivate when they rushed out my termination. It scanned green. The door buzzed open. Inside was cooler than expected, and dead quiet. Rows of racks, unmarked boxes, until we reached 42C. The moment Jeremy saw the binders, he let out a breath. "That's the audit trail." I nodded. "And that's the hard drive stack from 20172002. 0 from the looks of it. Unplug it. Wait." I pulled out my phone and snapped photos of everything. Multiple angles, metadata on, time-stamped and geotagged. Then, Jeremy carefully disconnected the key drives and bagged them in static shields. "This," he whispered, "is the kind of thing that gets people fired before they ask questions." "We're already fired," he smiled faintly. "True." As we walked out, I noticed a motion signature light flicker in the corner. "Someone's watching?" Jeremy asked. "Maybe. Or maybe just auto-syncered." I didn't answer, because I wasn't sure. Back at my house, we laid the hardware on my dining table, now turned into a temporary forensic lab. Jeremy brought out his encrypted diagnostic kit. Over the next 5 hours, we verified the chain of custody on every drive, matched hashes to archived signatures, and uncovered a backup copy of the vendor cap table, complete with time-stamped approvals from Preston and Janice's fiancé. We had redundancy, and more importantly, we had provenance. "This," Jeremy said, staring at the screen, "is an extinction event." "Not yet," I replied. "But it will be." That night, I sent one final message to Amelia. No subject, just a file, and one line, "You asked for proof." This is just the first layer. Then I turned off the lights, sat back in my chair, and listened to the fan hum of old systems still refusing to go quiet. Preston thought Zoom could erase me. He forgot who built the system that paid him. The email came at 5:13 a.m. and time-stamped just minutes after I sent Amelia the address. It wasn't meant for me. It was forwarded by accident, most likely through a misconfigured CC loop in the old Neptune chain that still had my ghost admin alias active. The subject line was vague. Follow-up, package confirmed, instructions needed. The body, however, changed everything. Before we use the PDF, we use a verified contents match Neptune diagnostic profiles. Awaiting directive, do we proceed with reformat plus burn or preserve for secondary review? Risk of exposure growing. Beneath it, a PDF attachment, just 18 kilobytes. I opened it and stopped breathing. It wasn't documentation. It was a photo. Grainy, time-stamped, clearly taken from a warehouse camera. Inside the frame, a server rack, 3 laptops, and a set of binders I recognized immediately. They weren't just trying to erase traces of fraud. They were preparing to destroy the legacy backbone of our infrastructure. Everything Veltria had relied on for the past decade did my decade. And then I saw something worse. A red tag attached to one of the drives. Archival, H-Cross, keychain verified. That was a kill signal. Alex, energy from the hard crossing. Cross was shorthand for hard cross link, an internal code used for marking systems flagged for permanent removal from offsite sync. It was supposed to be used only in extreme risk scenarios, like legal exposure or third-party audit subpoenas. Someone had escalated. Someone panicked. I pulled the metadata. The photo had been taken 36 hours ago, meaning the storage unit wasn't just a stash point, it was a staging area, and the burn protocol could go into effect at any moment. I needed to move, but I couldn't do it alone. That's when I forwarded the image to one person, Jeremy, our former compliance engineer. He'd been quietly laid off 2 months before me, supposedly due to restructuring, but I knew better. He'd once told me that Preston had tried to push him into signing off on a rushed vendor audit, one Jeremy refused to validate. That refusal vanished from records days later, but I had screenshots. I texted him, "Jay, need eyes on something, you were right. Meet?" 10 minutes later, he replied, "Location?" I sent him a pin to the diner 2 blocks from the storage unit. Jeremy showed up in an old hoodie, eyes wary. "They're burying everything," I said, sliding the image across the table. "You remember the old Neptune fallback systems?" He nodded slowly. "Yeah, you think they're in that unit?" "Not just that, more. They're calling for a burn, probably today." Jeremy leaned back, processing. "Why now?" "Because someone triggered the chain, possibly me." He nodded. "Then let's go." We didn't talk much on the drive, just silence and shared understanding. The kind only people who've both been discarded without explanation can share. At the unit, I didn't expect the manager to cooperate, but I still had my old badge, the kind IT forgot to deactivate when they rushed out my termination. It scanned green. The door buzzed open. Inside was cooler than expected and dead quiet. Rows of racks, unmarked boxes. Until we reached 42C, the moment Jeremy saw the binders, he let out a breath. "That's the audit trail." I nodded. "And that's the hard drive stack from 20172020 from the looks of it. Unplug it. Wait." I pulled out my phone and snapped photos of everything. Multiple angles, metadata on, timestamped and geotagged. Then, Jeremy carefully disconnected the key drives and bagged them in static shields. "This," he whispered, "is the kind of thing that gets people fired before they ask questions." "We are already fired," he smiled faintly. As we walked out, I noticed a motion-signatured light flicker in the corner. "Someone's watching?" Jeremy asked. "Maybe, or maybe just auto-signatured." I didn't answer, because I wasn't sure. Back at my house, we laid the hardware on my dining table, now turned into a temporary forensic lab. Jeremy brought out his encrypted diagnostic kit. Over the next 5 hours, we verified the chain of custody on every drive, matched hashes to archive signatures, and uncovered a backup copy of the vendor cap table, complete with time-stamped approvals from Preston and Janice's fiancé. We had redundancy. And more importantly, We had Providence. This, Jeremy said, staring at the screen, is an extinction event. Not yet, I replied, but it will be. That night, I sent one final message to Amelia. No subject, just a file, and one line. You asked for proof. This is just the first layer. Then I turned off the lights, sat back in my chair, and listened to the fan hum of old systems still refusing to go quiet. Preston thought Zoom could erase me. He forgot who built the system that paid him. The plan was to observe quietly, precisely, without creating noise, but when I pulled up to the Riverton South Annex that Monday evening, I didn't expect the keypad to still accept my override code. It blinked green, just like always. The door unlocked with a low hiss. They didn't change the access protocols, I murmured into the earpiece, Jeremy on the other end. Are you inside? He asked. Just walked in, I replied, heartbeat steady, but mind already racing. This wasn't the main building. This was the forgotten wing, the prototype server lab we decommissioned last winter, supposedly mothballed. Except I knew Preston had rerouted 4 legacy database mirrors here under the guise of a disaster recovery pilot. And because I was the one who'd helped design the fallbacks, I also knew the real reason. This lab didn't show up in external audits. No one tracked it, it was invisible, except to those of us who had ever been asked to hide something for someone with more power and less conscience. I moved carefully down the corridor. The lights flickered to life automatically. Motion singered like always. Each flicker brought back memory. Late nights rewriting code, emergency patches, whispered warnings. And then, the door at the end. Server Room B. Its name a misnomer now. Inside were 3 racks of gear, but the main focus was the secure terminal in the back corner. I approached, plugged in the portable drive Jeremy had given me, and watched the screen light up. The audit trail launched itself into motion, timestamp scrolling like a stock ticker. 10 seconds in, I saw it. A flagged transaction buried inside a third-party maintenance invoice. $48,000 billed to a vendor that didn't exist 6 months ago. And the signature? A digital approval from someone who no longer worked at the company. Or so I thought. Jeremy, I whispered, we've got forgery, and not just financial. Describe it. Digital authorization routed through an admin alias I terminated last year. They cloned credentials. That's internal sabotage, he muttered. Intentional? Exactly. I copied the entire log chain to a mirrored backup and encrypted it with 2-factor auth tied to my lawyer's emergency email. Then I turned to leave. That's when I heard it, a faint echo behind me, a door clicking shut. I froze. Not fear, just calculation. We're not alone, I whispered. Jeremy went silent. I moved toward the hallway, deliberately making no sound. And then I saw her. Amelia, standing near the emergency exit, holding a slim tablet, arms crossed. You always were better at door codes than goodbyes, she said quietly. I blinked. You tracked my access. Of course. Preston might have been sloppy. I wasn't. Her tone wasn't cold, but it wasn't warm either. So why let me in? I asked. Because I wanted to see what you'd do. Whether you'd come back with fury or with proof. And? You came back with both. She stepped forward, screen still active. Preston thinks I'm still on his side. But you were right. About everything. Then why stay? I asked. Because they stopped watching me weeks ago, and because I knew you'd come here. She turned the tablet toward me. On the screen, a snapshot of the same transaction log I'd just uncovered, except hers was timestamped 2 days earlier. You mirrored it? I asked. I built the mirroring protocol, she said, before they removed me from the loop. Why? Because they thought cutting me out of planning meetings would shut me up. She smiled, just faintly. It didn't. For a moment, we stood in that cold room full of noise, fans, whirs, the heartbeat of machines hiding the secrets of careless men. They left the lock unchanged, I said, because they thought no one would come back. They never expected someone to care this much, she replied. Or to remember. I handed her a second drive, the one with Jeremy's forensic analysis. Then let's finish this, she nodded. And as we stepped back out into the night, the door closed behind us with a quiet click. A lock they forgot. A silence they underestimated. And a reckoning they couldn't stop. By Tuesday morning, the company still hadn't realized what they'd done, and that was the part that fascinated me most. No one questioned why payroll hadn't been processed yet, or why the system hadn't triggered the routine fund disbursement sequence. In the past, it happened seamlessly every second Tuesday, Automated messages, system pings, manager approvals, but I'd quietly rerouted the final trigger, a single digital signature that now only I could authorize, from a secure sandbox account that no one else even knew existed. And until that signature went through, VeltraCorp's 100-odd employees weren't getting paid. I wasn't trying to hurt them. This wasn't about revenge against the staff. This was about timing, about precision, about creating a pressure point so undeniable that even the most arrogant among them, namely Brian himself, would have to acknowledge what they'd overlooked. I arrived at the office at 8:17 a.m. sharp. Not my office, obviously not anymore, but the building still recognized my credentials. The receptionist looked up, startled, then tried to smile like everything was normal. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked, voice a touch too high. "I'm just here to drop off something," I replied, calm. My hand rested lightly on a leather folder marked Systems Continuity Meet. Urgent. I didn't need to raise my voice. I didn't need to demand. I simply walked toward the boardroom. It was empty. Of course it was. No one expected me. But that was the beauty of it. I pulled out a spare tablet from my folder, powered it on, and projected the payroll dashboard onto the main screen. Still frozen, still unprocessed, still pending my override. A moment later, the door opened. "What the hell are you doing here?" Brian stood in the frame, his expression somewhere between panic and disbelief. "You're trespassing." I turned slowly, locking eyes with him. "No," I said quietly. "I'm here to return something you lost." I motioned to the screen. He followed my gaze, and when he saw the frozen payroll line item, his face went pale. "Where did you get this?" he asked. "Same place you left it," I answered, buried under 3 layers of unsecured approval logic. "You moved fast when you got rid of me, but not fast enough." He stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. "You think this is funny? You're messing with people's paychecks." "I'm not touching anything," I replied. "The system works just as it was designed to. All it needs is one final signature. Problem is, you fired the guy who built the signature logic." His mouth opened, then shut again. For the first time, Brian looked small. Not weak. He was too used to controlling rooms for that, but definitely cornered. "What do you want?" he asked. I didn't answer. Not yet. I let the silence stretch, the tension swell. I wanted him to feel the weight of it. The 100 employees refreshing their bank apps, the supervisors fielding emails, the HR reps whispering into phones. All of them waiting. All of it riding on one overlooked signature. Mine. "Let me guess," he said after a moment, trying to regain ground. "You're holding the company hostage unless we pay you off, is that it?" I smiled, slow and sharp. "Brian," I said evenly, "if I wanted to be paid off, I'd have already rerouted the funds. I didn't. The money's still sitting in the company account. I'm not stealing anything. I'm just not authorizing what I no longer trust." He blinked. "This is blackmail." "No," I replied. "This is foresight. This is a wake-up call. And this," I tapped the screen, "is your mess to clean up. I just came to show you the mirror." "We'll call legal," he said, reaching for his phone. "We'll have you arrested." "Go ahead," I said. "But before you do, you should check your own emails. There's one waiting in your inbox, time-stamped, logged, addressed to the board, contains screenshots of the payroll codebase and a full write-up on how it could be exploited had I chosen to. Which I didn't, because unlike you, I still care what happens to this company." He hesitated. I could see the thoughts racing. Legal exposure, PR disaster, audit risk. "What's in the folder?" he asked finally, nodding to the leather case I'd set down earlier. "A patch," I said. "Temporary authorization routing. Once signature, your new lead can enter it and release the funds. Clean, simple, documented." I paused. "But it expires at 5 p.m. today. After that, the system locks down. Security protocol. You'd need to rebuild from scratch." His eyes narrowed. "Why are you doing this?" I looked at him for a long beat. "Because people like Elaine still work here. Because my team didn't deserve what you did. And because if you're going to destroy something I spent 18 years building, I'm damn well going to make sure you understand how it was built first." Then I picked up the folder, handed it to him without another word, and walked out. Calm, collected, and one step ahead. Again, I didn't drive straight home after leaving that conference room. Instead, I pulled into a quiet corner cafe on the south end of town, the kind of place no one from corporate would think to go. It was the same cafe we used to gather at when the engineering team was still small, still scrappy, before the promotions, before the culture changed. I picked the same seat near the window, opened my laptop, and logged into a mailbox they'd forgotten existed. Years ago, when I led infrastructure, I'd set up an internal inbox for anonymous reporting, one that bypassed corporate servers. Just in case, I'd said. They approved it and promptly forgot it existed. But I hadn't. And in recent months, when whispers started swirling about skipped QA steps, silent code injections, and push deadlines with no safety nets, I'd quietly redirected that inbox to a private offsite server. I hadn't checked it in weeks. Today, I had a feeling. There were 32 unread messages, some were noise, but seven were exactly what I needed. A back-end engineer named Milo wrote that he'd been told to bypass authentication verification in the last rollout. A QA associate mentioned being reprimanded for flagging issues in the payment API. One even attached a screenshot of a Slack conversation, Brian's name at the top, saying, "Push it through. If it breaks, we'll fix it live." There it was, not a single smoking gun, but together, a pattern, not incompetence, a coordinated erosion of standards to meet deadlines and cut corners. It was no longer a matter of suspicion, it was proof. I gathered the emails, encrypted them, bundled them in a password-protected archive, and uploaded them to a secure cloud space. Then, I opened another tab, a draft email I'd written weeks ago but never sent. The recipients were 3 board members I still had a sliver of trust in: Judith Tanica, Anthony Wilkes, and Grant Holloway. All had stayed quiet during my exit, but not all silence means guilt. Some silence comes from not knowing what's been buried. The email was brief, no accusations, no attachments. Just one sentence. "This is your one chance to see what they've kept from you. The link below will expire in 12 hours. Below it, the link to the encrypted folder, accessible only to those with credentials I'd sent through a secure SMS channel." I hit send. Then I closed the laptop. I didn't need to wait and see. I knew what I'd sent, and I knew it would hit. I pulled out my phone and called Elaine. "I need you to confirm something," I said when she picked up. "The new back-end push. They tested it enough to check boxes." "Solemn," she said carefully. "But the audit trail for the bank API? It's missing logs, completely." I exhaled. "Do me a favor," I said. "Back up the last stable you've built and store it somewhere offline. Don't ask why, just please." She didn't ask. Elaine never did. "Done," she said. That night, I drove to the bridge and watched the city lights shimmer over the water. It was quiet. Peaceful. The kind of quiet I hadn't felt in months. When I got home, I poured myself a glass of bourbon and checked the email once more. Nothing. Midnight came and went, the link expired. But I'd done what I came to do. The next morning, at exactly 7:04 a.m., a new message appeared in my inbox. From Judith. The subject, "We need to talk." I clicked it open. Inside was a single sentence. "I've read everything. Please call me before noon." 10 minutes later, Grant replied, "Holy hell. When did this start?" I didn't reply to either. Let them process it. Let them sit in the same storm I'd weathered alone for weeks. The house was still, sunlight pushed in through the blinds. I opened the windows and let the air in. Then my phone buzzed again. This time a text from Elaine. "Check your burner inbox," she wrote. I did. Attached was a PDF. The document was an internal QA audit from 2 weeks ago, marked confidential. It showed discrepancies in transaction matching, approval trails missing, and a 30% drop in internal code coverage since Brian's team took over deployment schedules. At the bottom, the audit lead had flagged it with a red banner. "Escalate to engineering head immediately." That banner had been digitally removed from the final report submitted to the board. I stared at the screen. It wasn't just errors. It was cover-up, strategic suppression. I emailed the PDF to the same secure folder, then texted the access code to Judith. One more layer, one more thread pulled loose. At 10:41 a.m., a call came through. Unknown number. I let it ring twice, then picked up. "Rick?" Judith's voice was quiet. "We've convened an emergency audit committee. This can't wait. I need you on a call at 3 p.m. We're bringing legal counsel." I didn't smile. I didn't celebrate. I just said, "Understood. I'll be ready." And I was, because this was no longer about me getting back what was taken. It was about making sure they never did this to anyone else again. They tried to bury the message. They forgot I was the one who built the system it was buried in. Ballot. The calendar invite went out at 6:47 a.m., quietly sliding into their inboxes before most had finished their first coffee. Subject line, Infrastructure Escalation Review, 3 p.m. today. Organizer, Judith Tanaka. Required attendees, Brian Thorne, COO, Marissa Dale, Interim CEO, Grant Holloway, and Rick Madsen. Me. They hadn't expected that name. I'd been out for 2 weeks, silenced by a hasty Zoom termination and a locked company laptop. But my name still lived inside their servers, their folders, and apparently their conscience. For a moment I imagined Brian's reaction, scrolling through his phone at the gym or sipping espresso in that glass-walled executive lounge, his face paling just enough to spill a drop. Marissa would go into spin mode. She was always more political than technical, the kind who nodded thoughtfully at whiteboards but never really read the diagrams, and Grant, he'd be nervous. He knew enough to recognize danger when it knocked. I showed up early, not to the office. I'd never step foot in there again, but to the waiting room of the law firm where the board had booked the call. They'd chosen neutral ground. I chose to wear the same charcoal gray blazer from my first promotion 10 years ago. The one that still fit, still made me feel like the guy who'd built their infrastructure one layer at a time in server rooms no one else dared enter. At 2:59 p.m., the door opened. The receptionist gave a polite nod. "They're ready for you." I walked in, calm, precise, a USB drive in my pocket and a quiet storm behind my eyes. The room was all glass, brushed steel, and expensive lighting, designed meant to impress and intimidate. It didn't. On the screen, 6 faces stared back, some alert, some uneasy, one unreadable. Judith spoke first. "Thank you all for joining. Today's review was triggered by multiple independent concerns regarding system integrity and deployment oversight. Rick has been asked to walk us through his findings." No one objected. I plugged in the drive and let the slides load. No fanfare, just numbers, timelines, discrepancies. One by one, they lit up the screen. Mismatched deployment logs, missing QA signatures, vendor invoices signed before contracts were even drafted. No emotion in my voice, just precision. Marissa shifted in her seat. Brian leaned forward, feigning curiosity. "This is all interesting," he said finally, "but Rick's been gone for weeks. Why should we assume any of this is current?" I didn't flinch. "Because I built the parallel audit loop you didn't know was still active. The one that mirrors every high-value deployment into secure off-site storage before overwrites. You'd have to disable it at firmware level to erase it, which none of your team even attempted." Judith cleared her throat. "And we've confirmed access records. These were retrieved lawfully under emergency compliance protocols authorized during Rick's termination." Brian went quiet. Marissa looked like she'd swallowed glass. "Slide 13, I said. It showed a message from Brian, forwarded by an anonymous source, greenlit by his own initials. "Push to live. We'll backfill QA later." That line hung in the air like a dropped weapon. No one spoke. "How much damage?" Marissa finally asked. "It depends," I replied, folding my hands. "If no one's audited financial transactions tied to the custom invoice API, you may want to start there, and fast." Judith leaned forward. "Rick, are you willing to assist the third-party audit team if this escalates further?" "Yes. On one condition." "Which is?" "That I'm never reinstated, never paraded as the returning hero, and never asked to smile for a press release. I'm not here to reclaim anything. I'm here to make sure no one else walks out the way I did." For a moment, the only sound was the soft whir of the air conditioning. Then Judith spoke again, this time with quiet finality. "Understood." I stood, unplugged the drive, nodded once, and walked out, leaving the glass walls to echo with the weight of what they'd just seen. Outside, the sky had turned golden. Not the dramatic kind of victory light, just honest, late afternoon sun. The kind that tells you it's almost done, that it's safe to go home. They thought I was done, boxed out, deleted from the system like some temporary contractor who'd served his purpose and could be discarded without a second glance. But what Preston and Harrison never realized was that I had quietly built Riverton's infrastructure with one principle: resilience through continuity. Every system I implemented, every payroll function, every audit script, every backup routine had a and because no one ever asked, they never knew I'd designed the root credential system with a staggered redundancy protocol that allowed for silent logins under a pseudo-admin profile. A backdoor created years ago, not to do harm, but to protect against what I once called executive errors. On the night after the firing, while they were toasting to their cost-saving move at some overpriced steakhouse, I sat in my garage, coffee in hand, booting up an air-gapped laptop I hadn't used in over a year. I typed in the old alias, DR 7.4. It stood for Disaster Exception Recovery 7/4 Protocol. The terminal flickered, then accepted the handshake. I was in. Not through the usual channels, not through the polished dashboards Preston's nephew bragged about during meetings. No. This was core level. Shell commands, server logs, access points they'd never learned to read because it wasn't their job to understand the foundation, only to decorate the walls above it. I didn't do anything rash, no deletions, no uploads, no alarms, just a quiet review of what had changed. 6 weeks had passed since my termination, and already I saw red flags in the logs. Manual overrides of quarterly payroll entries, mass adjustments of contractor invoices, and the most telling sign, 4 temporary employee accounts that had executive-level access for 15 minutes at a time, every Thursday night between 1 o'clock and 1:15 a.m. Someone was siphoning, not enough to draw suspicion from basic auditing software, but just enough to accumulate. I traced one session's transfer path. It looped through an old vendor payment node, then out to a clearing account registered in Nevada under a holding company I recognized. Not from work. From a background check I'd done 2 years ago, when a procurement manager had quietly asked for my opinion about a potential investor. That investor's name? Clark Edison. Harrison Wells's personal accountant. I kept digging, line by line, access by access. The pattern was precise, quiet, and clearly orchestrated by someone who understood how to manipulate the systems I'd built. But they made one mistake. They didn't know about the log replication bot I had embedded in the codebase, task ID 229A. That bot didn't just archive system changes, it time-stamped everything into a separate, immutable database, stored on a secure cloud instance under my personal trust, a trust I'd established not for revenge, but in memory of my son Ethan. He once asked me, "Dad, what's the point of doing things the right way if the wrong people always win?" And I'd told him, because the right way always leaves a trail. And the truth is, the only thing that survives long enough to matter. That night, I copied the logs, clean, dated, and time-synced across servers. Then I closed the terminal, disconnected the machine, and stared at the dark screen, seeing my own reflection. Preston had fired me over Zoom. But he'd forgotten I was the one who'd approved payroll, designed the login systems, maintained the vendor protocols, and embedded the review automation that now held the very rope they'd be hanging by. It wasn't just negligence, it was arrogance. And in the quiet of that garage, with no audience and no applause, I knew this wasn't the end of anything. It was the start of something I'd built to last. They thought he'd vanish with a severance check in silence. After 18 years of building their entire backbone, every function, every line of code, every integration that kept payroll humming, they believed a cold Zoom call and 2 HR bullet points could erase that legacy. But the thing about systems, they remember who built them. And Derek wasn't bitter. He was prepared. That's the difference between being expendable and being essential. Only one of them knows how deep the foundation really runs. While they ordered pizza to celebrate budget optimization, Derek sat at home sipping his coffee, monitoring the internal fault lines no one else noticed. Because when you remove the architect and hand blueprints to a stranger, you don't just risk delay, you invite collapse. What they called clean transition was in fact 6 weeks of silent fragmentation. Vendor mismatches, payroll misfires, integrations that cracked under pressure. And when they panicked, he didn't yell, he opened a folder. That's how real leverage works. It's not about threats. An examination of his 3,782nd layer versus legacy logs, audits, a signature on a system license that still bore his name. Revenge didn't come in rage, it came in readiness. Because sometimes dignity means saying no to applause and yes to clean exits. Derek didn't want to return. He wanted to ensure no one else paid for their arrogance. And once that was done, he let them figure out the rest, with consultants billing triple and timelines bending until the very savings they chased became their biggest cost. This wasn't a war, it was a recalibration. And now, in a quiet home with no alerts flashing, Derek's calendar isn't booked with crisis meetings, it's booked with clarity, space, and the kind of respect that doesn't need a badge. So if you've ever been underestimated, misread, or let go by someone who mistook silence for surrender, remember this. Don't react. Prepare. Let the system fail where they never checked. Let your absence speak where your voice once did. And when the dust settles, let your peace be louder than their panic. If this story hit home, subscribe. These aren't just revenge tales, they're lessons in leverage. Share this with someone building in silence, waiting for the day the system speaks their name again, not with noise, but with proof.